This is Laurie A. Couture. Please introduce yourself to the audience.
Yes, I am Laurie A. Couture. I'm the author of Instead of Medicating and Punishing. I am a attachment parenting and alternative education coach, and I also have experience in the mental health field. I've worked with children and families for over 16 years in multiple capacities, so I am an expert in all areas of child development.
Well, that's awesome. We talked a little bit about off the air, actually, and we discussed this. The same question I ask is, at what moment in your life did you decide to go from being someone who was just part of the world to being someone who wanted to change it and make it better?
That moment actually came when I was 9 years old. Actually, I was in a pretty difficult situation, a lot of trauma in my life as a child, and I had this very specific moment where I looked out the window and I said, if I survive this childhood, when I grow up, I'm going to make sure that no child has to go through what I've gone through. And I made a pact to the universe, basically, in that moment. And there were times in my adolescent years that I thought I was going to lose touch with that, but I always came back to it. And in my late teens, I started becoming very passionate about fighting for the rights of children and youth. And I began working in various capacities doing that, helping children, doing a lot of volunteer work, mentoring. I started working in early childhood education, and that's some of the way I realized the problems in the educational system. I worked as a social worker. I then worked in the mental health field, and then I wrote my book. And I also was in the film The War on Kids, talking about just the detriments to children of the public school system and how the public school system is literally a socializing agent to dull down and dumb down and control the population of the country.
That's awesome. Actually, I remember that film, and I've reviewed that film before on my show. It's a good film. Especially in discussing the issues of public education. I had a conversation once about that recently. Actually, not too recently. I did a radio show about it, and it actually erupted because my daughter was going to her first day of school, and my friends were asking me why I didn't homeschool. And normally I am actually a very big proponent of it. If it weren't for the fact that I had extensively spoken to the kindergarten teacher in question and found her to be a very alternative thinking kind of person, which made me wonder how she got the job in our school system. My daughter would be homeschooled right now. But in general, the conversation that came about because of it, the opposition to it were like, well, your child won't be properly socially adjusted. And I was like, when I went to school, there were a lot of things I was expected to be socially adjusted to that I would really rather not be socially adjusted to.
The socialization thing is such an eye roller for those of us in the homeschooling community, because it's such a myth, and a lot of times, those parents of us that are in the homeschooling community, we get good laughs out of that because we're standing there with our children who have hundreds of contacts a year and friends. My son who just turned 18 had 10 kids at his rock climbing birthday party last month. So there is no shortage of socialization. In fact, what the so-called socialization that homeschooled children get is the real world. You interact with people in your community. You meet people of all ages. You relate based on mutual interests. There is not a competition based on your looks or the kind of clothing you're wearing or what group you fit in. Nobody's going to be shunning you for those things. My son and his friends are so diverse. So many of them have so many different interests. He has friends all across the board, from music-related friends to metal music, to rock climbing kids, to kids who are into Dungeons and Dragons, kids who like building, kids who like inventing. He's all across the board, and all of these kids accept one another for the things that they do have in common just because they care about each other. So, he's had the same friends He makes new ones all the time, and there's none of this horrible drama that goes on in the public schools, none of this unsafe, dangerous behavior. There's no teenage rebellion. So all of that is a myth used to just scare people away from it. There's actually no time for children to socialize in public school anyway, because they're just sitting at desks all day doing nothing, and the designated times are used just to reassert the social groups and shun people and harass them, and children are harassed to the point where they want to commit suicide or commit homicide. And it's so severe that these children are coming out of the public school with, symptoms of complex PTSD.
For sure. No, and I know exactly what that's like. I went to school in a I had both kinds of experiences, because I lived sometimes with my poor mother and sometimes with my more well-to-do father. And so therefore I experienced both the problems of living in a low economic situation in school and living in a higher economic situation. And the funny thing is, I guess probably because I was already adjusted to the low economic situation, I actually experienced less stress in the far more violent environment of the low economic situation than I did in the high the high economic situation, where the kids were so materialistic, and your shoes determined your value as a human being. Literally, if people are like, they pick on you. No, they try to mentally destroy you if you're not dressed the way it is. You need you to be. It's funny to me, actually, because we discuss this frequently on the show as different, sociological theories about authority, and, people do, we do have a lot of anarchists who listen to the show who feel that authority figures themselves are the problem, and I usually have to point out to them, I'm like, there are no specific authority figures that empower the in-crowd when you're going to a public school to control virtually every aspect of your life. They take that authority on their own through bullying, and essentially through picking on people, and the schools seem to be completely incapable of doing anything about it. So if there were any authority figures, they're not doing their job.
Well, the schools actually are creating it, because there is absolutely children, when they're in public school, they are literally in a hostage imprisoning situation. They're in prison for 6 hours a day, and they're still in prison when they leave, because they're forced to do unpaid labor, or what they call homework at home. So they don't have any free time designated to them, because then it's filled up with all the extracurriculars. So school literally controls every cell of your body. Children can't go to the bathroom when they need to. They can't eat. They can't hydrate. They can't move. They have to sit in that seat and do and think and regurgitate exactly what is expected of them. So because these children are stripped of any sense of empowerment for themselves and any ability to direct their own body or their own learning process, they have to go outside of the power structure in order to create their own opportunities for control and power. Since they have no power in school, they know that the peer group is now something that they can control. And so therefore, certain ones of those have the power to be able to manipulate and become, very authoritarian with the peer group. And the peer group just sort of takes on a mind of its own, and they divide and conquer themselves. And, of course, the teachers in the school have no ability to control it, because, this is a situation where kids have figured out that they do have control, with controlling the minds and controlling the emotions of the other kids and controlling their actions. Whereas if public schools ran as democracies, like the country is supposed to be, and like certain schools do that are democratic schools that are not public schools, like the Sudbury Valley Free School, Summerhill School, which has been running since the 1800s, Albany Free School, if those schools, there is a complete democracy where children are free to do as they wish. They can learn and do and move around as much as they need. They can take care of all their basic biological and emotional needs there. And there are not, these power cliques where kids are committing suicide. That the dynamic of kids being cruel to one another is a socially constructed thing by the public schools. That is not normal kid behavior. I just want to make that clear.
No, that's actually very insightful. Yeah. And
I think
It almost, it's interesting you say that because it does feel that, because it does generally only take place in that, and unfortunately it does kind of follow us into our real life. That's the reason that I studied that, because I'm actually in the middle of researching a documentary more specifically about internet trolls and cyberbullies.
Yes.
We get into a situation where I realize that people have a tendency, and they get created, this gets created for them in school, where they seek to create circumstances of social hierarchy so that they can feel elite or feel better than some other group over there. You find it kind of echoes in the workplace. It echoes in people's hobbies, even like group hobbies. You end up with these some people are popular, some people are not. We haze the people that are not popular. You kiss the derrieres of the people that are. If you want to be an accepted member of this society,
Sure.
then you've got to toe the line and you got to play the pyramid scheme
Absolutely.
game. And people are not aware of it, or rather sometimes they are, and then they just go, well, that's just the way it is, and then they cop out.
This is all part of the distractions that the government expected when they instituted forced public schooling in 1852. They wanted this to happen. I mean, if you're so busy being distracted by all these ridiculous little hierarchies and all these little one-upmanships that all these people do, and you've got to keep up with the Joneses, and you've got to make sure you got all the latest gadgets, and you have to watch the latest episode of, American Idol or whatever is on, or Dexter, and then talk about it and sound like you're in the in, then you have no time to watch what your government is doing, and no time or any caring, for that matter, any empathy for the situation of the world. See, all of that is socially engineered. It's built in, and it was built in 1852. I mean, they knew what they were doing back then, and it's working just perfectly.
Now that's and that's actually, you use the term social engineering, and that's very poignant, especially to my audience, because we recognize that, and many people don't. And then you start to talk about how, well, somebody wanted this, and then they don't really like to discuss that. Obviously, they'd kind of like to pretend that that this is the society, that this is how it's supposed to be, and basically, especially like we talk about that as how consumerist culture was created quite intentionally by Edward Bernays, and his work for different corporations, like how they convinced women psychologically that they should be smoking. Just different ways that they targeted that. And I noticed that's built into the children's culture too. The consumerist culture of, I need $100 pair of sneakers. And if the sneakers don't have Foot Locker attached to them, like they would literally leave the tags on the sneakers to prove they purchased them at Foot Locker, where they're $40 more expensive, well, then you get made fun of for wearing those sneakers.
Oh, you don't have to tell me that. I remember I had to have $68 Guess jeans, and I remember haggling my grandmother that I couldn't get my grandmother said, well, these also have a triangle logo on the back pocket. And I said, well, I can't wear those because they don't say Guess.
Right.
And, and I remember that growing up in the 80s, that I think the 80s was where that became the most severe, where you had to have a certain brand of clothing. You had to wear the clothing a certain way, though. So you couldn't just have the clothing. It had to be worn a certain way. And of course, I have no problem with personal expression, but I do have a problem where the personal expression has to look like everyone else's. My son likes to experiment with black lipstick and all kinds of crazy outfits, but he's not doing that because anyone else is doing it. He's doing it because it's his way of expressing himself, and he admires a lot of the metal bands from the 80s and even the late 70s. And this is a form of expression that he chooses to do based on nobody else's assessment. And his friends usually are like, hey, dude, that's cool. And that's as far as they go, even though usually the friends aren't doing it. Most of his friends aren't dressing that way. He's a performer, so he does like to do that. And it's his own style. It's not based on anyone else's. And so the problem is that the public schools and the consumerist absolute virus in our culture, the advertisers, marketers know that teens love to express themselves. They know that they love just ornate dress, and so they exploit that. And the public schools are completely designed to fuel into that industrialism, that mindset of raising you to work until you die and buy things. That's it. That's your purpose in life. You never hear when they talk about education reform, which of course is impossible. You can't reform a system that was built on oppression. But you always hear in the education reform talk about we need to have these children prepared for a global marketplace. Well, you know what? That's not my child's. It's not my goal for my child. My goal for my child is for him to be happy, for him to live his passions and dreams. But yet, for some reason, parents don't seem to hear that. They only hear this rhetoric that we have to prepare children to take their place in the global marketplace. Well, I'm not sure about anyone else, but I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in myself or my son being a part of that.
Absolutely. No, it's because of the documentary Consuming Kids. I'm sure you've probably seen that one. Is the reason that my children never watch advertising ever, like ever. Like, I'm very specific on what I let them watch, and the message that it sends, and I pay attention to that. Many parents don't do that. They don't look at what their kids are watching, and then they wonder where all these behaviors come from. But at the same token, though, I mean, there, and that actually kind of brings up another controversial issue. I'd have to say, though, is one of the things I brought up previously, and I'd like to consult with your opinion about it, is that the public school system creation of the of the stressful situations can create sometimes huge outbursts of violence. When I went to school in the inner city, obviously you see it much more often, but the Columbine shooting was a situation where that they really did not look very closely at the root cause of the problem. They wanted to talk about Mortal Kombat or Doom or violent video games or whatever. I'm like, I've every violent impulse I ever had while going to school was based entirely on being locked in a room with a bunch of people I'd really rather not be talking to because they're a bunch of mean jerks, and wanting them to leave me alone. It had nothing to do with playing Mortal Kombat or, not to say that I let my children play those video games either, but they weren't looking at the real base issue. You can get rid of all the Mortal Kombat in the world, and you can put on more metal detectors or whatever, but kids have been pushing other kids around in the system long before Mortal Kombat or Doom. And
they were blaming actually Marilyn Manson and trench coats. That was also what their primary thing. They were blaming for the, because they don't want to blame the environment, of course.
Right, because then they would be responsible. And everybody's always passing the buck. And, I thought very heavily, because I was actually still kind of in school at that time, that I don't approve of what they did, but I probably understand why they did it. I understand probably what was going through their head at the time. And anybody who really studied it found out that these were two kids who were heavily tormented, and attacked endlessly. So it's kind of a matter of, there's so many stories that are like that. I remember when I was going to school, there was a kid who had brought a gun to school and, had shot the kid that kept calling him fat and then shot himself. This is a tragedy. Does this have anything to do with Doom, or does it have to do with the kid being permitted to, endlessly victimize this other child until he went to that point? Then they want to, it's just basically, this is one of the reasons why Jacques Fresco, the Venus Project, all that stuff I talked about off the air, the idea of addressing things at the root cause of the problem, finding the source of the behavior, and then eliminating that source and creating a healthy environment that cultivates good behavior rather than trying to spend all of your time trying to scare people out of negative behavior, is definitely a beneficial way to look forward towards the future. And we're already seeing it work in the places that it's being tried. And so this actually, I was just kind of trying to, bring about, have some general conversation with you to get the audience to know who you are and what you were doing and where you stand. And I think they're all going to be very impressed with what they've heard so far. Now, I know that you're writing a new book, which is one of the main reasons, actually, that initially, because I didn't know about all this other great stuff about you before, I read your article about how boys are treated differently than girls. And one of the things that has been very frustrating for me as an activist is that I've noticed that certain rights groups have a tendency to overdo certain things. Like, a feminist rights group might get to the point where they're almost sexist in their approach. Like they're
not almost sexist. They are blatantly sexist.
Right. They're so pro-woman that they get to the point that they're anti-man. And, you see it also in the racist groups. They're so one that they become anti the other. Even the ones that are claiming to be like, I had a friend actually who is an activist. He's part of a group called BAM, by any means necessary, and they're kind of like an outcropping of like the Black Panther groups and stuff. And I'm not saying all of those activists were ever negative, but like I asked him one day, because in Pontiac, where I grew up, there was a lot of black on white racism, a lot of black kids beating up white kids. And I asked him, I'm like, do you consider that racism? He's like, no, that's not racism. I was like, okay, they specifically targeted the kids who were white because they were white. That's not racism? No, that's, you see, we have a history of oppression, and that's just natural lashing out. I was like, okay, ... and I've dealt with situations with, with feminist women who are just as ruthless when talking about men, and even within peace activist groups, every now and then, the Occupy movement, for example, I'll hear comments made about what white men do, and it makes me twitch because I come from a totally non-racist, non-sexist environment, and I've so totally moved past all of that, and when I hear that, I'm like, it makes me like seriously offended. I'm like, did you just make a generalization about me because I'm a man or because I'm white? I'm like, what does that sound like? Do you realize what you sound like? And they sometimes they just don't. So, commenting a little bit on that, and then let's move into your book immediately following about how that happens at childhood.
Oh, absolutely. I've been, like I said, I've been working with children and families for over 16 years, and I've worked in so many different capacities that I actually am very aware of the roots of the feminist lobby. And I will tell you firsthand that there are multiple very politically powerful, and I'm going to call them political feminist groups, that actually are blocking funding for services for boys and men. They deliberately ignore the research, especially the research done by Dr. Murray Strauss at the UNH Family Research Lab and others who have found that domestic violence is actually equal between men and women, which means that men and women perpetrate it and are the victim of it equal. And actually women slightly abuse their spouses or partners more than male partners, more than slightly more, but I think it's like maybe 51 or 52%. So they're slightly higher. It comes out that way in all studies. So the feminist political lobby has an agenda to block awareness of male victims of sexual assault and male victims of domestic violence and male victims of violence in general. Boys and men are the overwhelming victims of violence in the world, on the planet. It's men and boys who are suffering with their lives. Boys are sexually abused equally to girls. They are equally or more vulnerable than girls, and I say they're more vulnerable because nobody wants to see them as potential victims. And the feminist movement is directly blocking evidence and research and awareness to the public that women sexually abuse children in very large numbers. We don't know exactly how much because men don't report, boys don't report. There are strong social taboos about reporting, and that if boys are exploited, they're supposed to like it.
Right.
And a lot of times, sadly, one of the things that a lot of the general public does not know is that if a law is not in place seeing a certain thing as sexual assault, then it will not be counted in the crime statistics. So all these years that the FBI has been collecting rape statistics, men as victims, boys and men as victims have never been counted because it was just I believe it was either the end of December 2011 or just the turn of this month, 2012, that the FBI finally recognized the rape of males and now will count them in the rape statistics. Now, they have not been counting all the prison rapes that happen. I think there estimates about 10,000 prison rapes a year, and that's just an estimation based on who reports it.
Right.
So really, all of these groups that are trying to block awareness are really doing harm to human beings. They're not really human rights groups. What I believe is that there is no excuse for any form of violence against anybody. And violence is any action, any word, or any sort of disposition towards somebody where you are cutting them down, where you are trying to overpower them, or you are trying to coerce them against their will to believe something. So the comments that you were talking about generalizing you being a white man, that is a form of violence, and it's just as inappropriate as if you had said anything in the reverse. So excuse me, let me just take a sip of water here.
Sure. And actually, I guess I'll take a moment to comment on that while you're doing that. Is that it? It's funny is that kind of actually comes back to like why I'm making the film that I'm making, is that verbal and mental abuse are very much prevalent in conversations. In political debate in particular, people can be beaten down into submission solely through humiliation and personal attacks, and
sure.
And it's. I used to be part of the Libertarian Party, and they have a non-aggression principle at their core that you have to agree to when you join them. But once you join them, you're in a situation where they are vicious verbally with one another if you're not towing the line. For supposedly free-thinking society, they will just be mean to you until you go along with it.
That's right. See, that's the key, is that there's violence in every group. All of these separatist groups that people put themselves in, political parties, political groups, all of these isms, they're all violent. They might they might start out in the beginning with a goal of equality and human rights, but it ends up going over the top. There is no need for feminism in Western societies. Right now, if there's any need for feminism, it needs to be over in Afghanistan and Saudi Arabia. That's where they need to move their efforts, where women don't actually have equality. Here in the Western society, this is becoming more and more a feminist-based society, and that is why I'm writing, to get back to the second book.
Sure.
My second book is, the working title right now is Nurturing and Empowering Our Sons. And off the top of my head, I think the subtitle is Healing and Celebrating our sons through attachment parenting and unschooling. I think it's just off the top of my head with the byline, the subtitle. And basically why I wrote this book is I've been collecting data for over, almost 20 years now, since I was out of high school. I graduated in 1992 from high school, and I literally was starting to collect data back then on how boys are treated with just this absolutely hateful, anti-male, shaming attitude. But it's become severe, especially since the late 90s and early 2000s. And I saw it more and more in my work. And when I got into the social work and human services field, that's when I became aware of this strong, severe feminist bias where I'm actually, in order to renew my license every year or every 2 years, I'm required to take trainings, and sometimes to get some of the trainings you can do purchased. You can do purchase trainings where you read like a long passage or an essay, and then you answer questions. And there has actually been times where I'm forced to answer in a biased manner in order to get my CEUs. For instance, I'm trying to think. One question was true or false. True or false, a therapist must not have strict neutrality in a male-female couples situation, but must sometimes align with the woman rather than maintain that strict neutrality. And I of course, would have chosen false, because the basic premises of the therapeutic relationship is that it needs to be a place of safety and neutrality for all people in the room.
Mm-hmm.
But the actual answer they wanted was true, that it's okay in a situation where it's a male-female couple to discriminate and bias against the man and align with the woman, even though that goes against basic therapeutic principles. So it's that severe, where in graduate school, the literature was so anti-male and so pro-female that it got to the point where you were gagging on it. It was like eye-rolling, like, oh, my God, come on already. And so I'm writing this book because I see that boys are being demonized and pathologized to epidemic levels in society. Probably one of the most extreme measures that are being taken is that in public schools, boys are being labeled as having this fictitious disorder, ADHD, which, by the way, there's no scientific proof that it's anything other than a collection of trauma symptoms or just natural childhood behavior. So boys are being labeled as ADHD or bipolar or oppositional defiant disorder, a number of these different brain and mental illnesses, and then, of course, subsequently chemically subdued or drugged. And this is happening in epidemic numbers, especially because of the public schools. And the mental health industry doesn't question this. They just do it. I have actually lost contracts by speaking out against this in the mental health field. I have been silenced. I have been threatened. I had my website threatened to be forcibly removed back when I used to run a volunteer children's website where I didn't make any money from it at all, and children's rights website. And so the situation is severe. And so I realized that I needed to write a book about all of the injustices that are being done to boys and men, especially boys, because it's from a parenting perspective, especially things like how boys are being treated, that male sexuality is shamed, the male body is shamed. Right from infancy, little boys are mutilated through circumcision. They are tormented in this manner. They don't realize that this creates complex PTSD. It alters brain development. So any violence that child would later commit would probably never be related to the fact that he was violently raped by, having part of his penis removed. So all of these things that the feminists are not taking into account and don't even want to look at when they're directed to it, and boys experience the most physical abuse overall and the most verbal abuse. They are hit the most, especially by mothers. Mothers do most of the hitting of children. And so if you look at all of I have so much data that I almost wonder if I can get it into one book without the book needing a wheelbarrow enclosed.
It almost sounds like it should be a documentary, like with interviews and all that.
It would be great. I haven't even gotten to the point yet where I'm going to do any more than a couple interviews because I've got just so much data.
Right.
And of course, I'm not going to write it in a data-based manner in a very dry. I'm not going to do the statistical thing. My brain doesn't work that way, but I'm taking it all and spelling it out in black and white. My first book, instead of Medicating and Punishing, was written in a very simple manner. I took very, very complex and very science-based facts, and I wrote it in a way that anybody could understand it because it's basic science. If a child's needs aren't being met in any way, their holistic needs, their physical needs, their emotional needs, their creative needs, their intellectual needs, their spiritual needs, if any of those needs aren't being met, then they're going to act out. It's just plain and simple. So these boys are being pathologized for normal boy behavior because they cannot handle this developmentally inappropriate environment of being forced to sit in chairs for 6 hours a day when boys need to be moving, jumping, running, playing. All children need that, but especially boys. They are wired to be body-minded. And that's,
to comment
we're
just
killing
a few
our
things.
children.
No, I agree. Just to comment on a few things, I would point out, also that you hit a nail on the head about the sexuality issue, and as you said, we're talking about about parenting level, and it is relevant to men because this is where the foundation is set, and then you see it happen in society. You see it in our legal system. The restraining order system is ridiculous. I read a great article about that. The fact that many states were the quote-unquote woman's state for so long, the women get custody no matter how abusive they are, no matter how crazy they are. I have personal experience with that, although, I ended up in joint custody. It's still they were blind to virtually everything I had on her, and it was treated like I'm lucky that I'm even getting joint custody. I should just take it, They don't really, especially when they're assessing things, like if there's a domestic violence call, the police are immediately looking at you if you're the male.
And they'll even arrest the man, even if he's saying that even if the woman is admitting that she was the abuser, the man will get arrested a lot of times.
And that also affects our children because our children see that treatment of adults, adult males, and for example, they want to know why their daddy was taken by the policeman. Does that mean daddy was wrong? And even if they know he's not, so I definitely I was lucky enough that my mom I was raised by a single mom, and I was lucky enough that she was very sensitive to these issues, and that she had boys and she had girls. She had 2 daughters and 2 sons, and if the daughters were having emotional problems due to their monthly visitor, my mom did not give them a carte blanche. She didn't say, well, oh, okay, sweetheart, it's okay that you were mean to your brother because it's that time of the month. She'd be like,
exactly.
It's that time of the month. You should probably recognize that you're going to have some irrational tendencies, and you should remove yourself from the situation. You don't take it out on your brother.
Absolutely.
And when I went out into the real world, quote unquote, the real world, there was so little of that I felt like an alien, because to me, gender was invisible to me. It was irrelevant. Okay, yeah, you're a girl. Okay, you're a boy. That did not even factor in, to me, because I truly believe that they were equal.
What's interesting? I'm sorry.
No, you finish. Go ahead.
I was going to say, what's interesting is that my son has encountered some, a new phenomenon now where little girls are getting so brazen, and they are so fueled by what he calls divaism. Mm-hmm. And this sense of girl superiority over boys, that now little girls will go up to teenage boys and outrightly be verbally or even physically abusive to them. I remember my son was with, on the 4th of July, my son was with a group, this huge peer group of homeschooled kids. They're mostly all teenagers. And we went to this lake for the kids to watch the fireworks, and they were all running around with glow sticks. And so what ended up happening was one of the families that hosted the party invited some of the neighbors to come along and bring their younger kids down. So we had this huge, big, gathering down at this lake, and the kids were throwing a football around and running down the dock with the glow sticks, and it was really positive and really sweet, and to see them all just being kids and having a good time. Now, my son at the time was 17 years old, and this little girl, about 9 years old, got mad because my son is one of those people that if he thinks for a minute that there's somebody that is getting left out, he will go out of his way to make sure that person is included. And so he was trying to pass the football to the smaller children, the younger kids first, and make sure they all had a turn. And so there was this 9-year-old girl, and he had passed the football to her, and then he wanted to make sure another younger child had a chance. And so the girl, the 9-year-old girl, got really angry that she didn't get the football a second time, and that when the football was dropped, she grabbed the football, and she went up to my son, and she chucked the pointy end at his side with all her force and just made a sound. And he was so shocked. He was like, whoa, what's that about? And I just went over to her and I said, don't ever do that again to anybody. And so I went over to her and I really said, wow, that was so not okay. And because I confronted her after that, she was actually really nice to my son and I. But my son said she had been really slick with him the whole time, and then that was sort of the shocker to me. And I've seen that multiple times, and he has told me about friends of his who might go to alternative schools, but maybe some of their other siblings go to the public school. And he said some of those sisters are so nasty. And he said, and the younger ones have no qualms with insulting all the boys in the room. And I remember when I was a little kid, we were afraid of teenagers. We wouldn't have insulted any teenager.
Right.
So the sad thing is that girls are being socialized to be aloof, apathetic, nasty, sarcastic, and cruel rather than empathic and caring like they want the boys to be. But
right.
At the same time, there's nobody treating boys with an empathic, compassionate frame of mind. Nobody's treating them with compassion and empathy, but they're expected to be that way anyway. So
right.
There's this crazy schizophrenic situation in society where it's basically okay for people to be hostile to one another rather than everyone needs to be treated with love and respect, starting with how parents treat children.
And it's interesting, as you said, everyone, and that's, I think, one of the important points about this is that frequently many activists get involved in things because maybe they've been done wrong by a certain group or a certain this or a certain that. Jacques Fresco talks about that. There are no woman problems, there are no man problems, there are no black problems. We are a people, we are human beings, and the funny thing is we tend to exasperate the problem that we set out to solve by making more divisions, by making more resentment. It's like I said, I was surrounded by activists who are concerned supposedly about equal rights, yet they're spending all of their time talking about white men supposedly talking too much, during our conversations. And to me, I looked at, I was like, the person in charge of this meeting is a woman, and she's doing great, and I didn't even factor in whether or not I was talking over someone who was black or female. And in fact, until you said that, I wasn't even conscious that there were any women or black people in the room. I was conscious that I was sitting with a bunch of human beings, and we were all exchanging on an equal level, and their color or their gender were completely irrelevant to me until you pointed it out. And now all the white men in the room feel bad and are scared to communicate because they're afraid that they're going to offend, you guys. I'm like, that doesn't that's not equality. That's it's not even fair,
It's a tough situation though, because there is so much racism
Sure.
in our culture still towards every race, including from black, white, Latino, especially immigrants coming over. So I don't feel that conversation is done by any means. But I think that with feminists, I think that is a dead goose that has been overcooked for the last 20-something years, and maybe 30 actually, because I think it was done at the end of the 70s. But you're right. No person's voice should be shut out because of some physical characteristic of theirs. We all are in this together. Oppression against one human being is oppression against the entire human race. When you look deep inside of us spiritually, all of us are just spirits. We're all the same. There is no gender or color or race or nationality. That's only our vessel. It's a genetic vessel, and it's absolutely ridiculous that we're caught up on it. But really, what needs to happen is there needs to be a consensus of respect and human decency and compassion and empathy for everyone. It shouldn't. I just saw something the other day that I was horrified in New Hampshire, where they just passed a bill allowing businesses to discriminate against gay and lesbian couples if they feel that it goes against their religion. I mean, what is this, the 1950s? This is ridiculous.
Oh, my goodness. No, that is one of my biggest hot-button issues.
And New Hampshire is such a progressive state. That's why that was so shocking.
And if you think about it, it means you're gay. They always I'm a gay rights activist and I'm totally straight. And when you get mad at somebody or you're passionate about it, they're like, you're gay, aren't you? I'm like, no. I don't want anybody to be mistreated based on that. And I should probably clarify, I think my point is not to say that racism is not still a problem, because it is, but I don't think we should replace it with another form of racism.
You're right, absolutely.
And that's not. When I went to school in Pontiac, they actually allowed the Farrakhan Muslims, the black racist Muslims, to have an assembly at our school. At my public school, I got to sit there and listen to them tell us that the white men are the cursed race of Cain and that mulattoes were abominations. And we're just like, whoa, hold on a second here. And fortunately enough, a lot of the black kids were equally offended by what was going on. But, it was more to the point is that let's identify that racism is bad and sexism is bad. And I don't, if you're a racist white, black, Asian person, then you need to reevaluate. If you're a sexist male or female, you need to reevaluate. And instead of making it about it's only racism if it's this person, it's only sexism if it's that person.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. I noticed that too. And it's if somebody is making a judgment on you based on a physical characteristic, it is just what that says. There is no, monopoly on the word.
Sure. Now, when it comes
I don't have tolerance with discrimination of any type. I don't have tolerance for people who advocate for any sort of violence or hatred towards anybody. I just have no tolerance for it. I haven't had tolerance for it since I was 9 years old, or my whole life. I always saw through that, and I just didn't understand what everybody was fighting over all the time.
And that's, but I guess one of the reasons I brought all that up was to point out that it's now necessary that you write a book about what's going on with boys, because it's necessary to spread awareness, because we've overcompensated. It's like the feminist movement won their basic rights and said, well, hey, we smell blood, let's keep going, and then
that's exactly it.
They start pushing it further.
It actually is really serious, and I'm not saying that all of the feminist political lobby are into this, but there was a situation where there was a prominent lawyer who, a feminist, a fringe feminist, what they call the radical feminists, and she was sort of encouraging conversation on a blog about having gynecologists get in on, female gynecologists, of course, get in on aborting male fetuses, so that they would be reducing the population of males down to 10%. And this is really terrifying. This is terrifying because this is a hate group, and this is allowed to appear on blogs and without impunity. And so it is not just this sort of surface sort of things with women just saying mean things about men. This is at a level where the core of this feminist group, which is based, I think it's based on the 1968, there was a manifesto called the Scum Manifesto by, I hope I'm getting her name right, Valerie Salinas, who shot Andy Warhol. She advocated back in 1968 for the genocide and murder of men. It is one of the most violent things I've ever read. It's like Mein Kampf or something. And she, this is not just some fringe document that sits in archives from 1968. This is actually used and spoken about, and even from what I've heard from people, kind of almost upheld, with a little bit of respect in women's study groups. And there was a group at UNH in 2005, a group of women that actually used the Scum Manifesto as the basis for a gathering where they were wearing scissors around their neck, symbolizing castrating men, and they were just reading all of this absolutely hateful poetry and just directing all this hate towards men. Now, these are young women. These are young women that probably are between the ages of 18 and 23 years old, and it's really frightening that to think that these young women are being socialized in this manner. Because if a man was advocating for a document that called for the mutilation and torture and genocide of women, and then brought that document from 1968 into 2005 and started, collecting other young men to, wear scissors around their neck or something, or wear a cattle prod around their neck, symbolizing, some sort of violence towards the genitals, and had all of this violent, hateful poetry read against women, that would have never flown. That would have never even been allowed to seed at UNH. That wouldn't have even happened. So that's what I'm talking about.
Sure.
Hatred is hatred. Violence is violence. It needs to not be tolerated in any form.
And that's actually, going back to what you were talking about the statistics about men being raped and that not being really talked about. Like, one of the more extreme feminists that I've dealt with in my time, she said that rape was a female problem. Rape is a crime, that's only for women. And I pointed out to her, I said, well, men get raped too, right? And she's like, well, it's just such a small number that's insignificant. I'm like, I'll bet it felt pretty damn significant to the guy getting raped.
That's right. You know what? If one person gets assaulted, if one person gets raped or sexually assaulted, one child or adult, that's one too many. Mm-hmm. But that's not the case. It is not a small amount of men. It is and it's a lot. We don't have the statistics because of the feminist movement, but we do know that male prisoners are raped in pretty epidemic numbers. We do know that little boys are sexually assaulted. We do know that teenage boys are raped very, very often by school teachers, by female school teachers. It is a serious issue. It is not a gender issue. Rape has been happening to boys and men throughout history on every continent, in every society. If you look into the Journal of Psychohistory, you will just see the pages of those journals filled with documentations of sexual abuse of boys and men, just rapes that, even some of the early kings in England were sexually assaulted on a daily basis by their caretakers. I don't want to say which one because I don't know if I have his name right, but Louis, one of the Louis, Louis not great with the European history, but it's historically rampant and may even be more than the abuse of females, possibly when you put everything together, all the numbers
For
around
sure.
the world.
And
I am not in any way, minimizing the rape and abuse of girls and women. Absolutely not. What I'm trying to say is that it's happening in almost equal numbers, possibly equal numbers. Doesn't matter. If one human being is being affected by it, it's no longer just a one-gender issue. You could say, you can't even say that breast cancer is a woman's issue because men die of breast cancer as well.
Yes, they do.
The only things you can say are specific to men and women are things that have directly affect their chromosome or their anatomy.
Well,
and even then there's leeway.
And that kind of comes back to what I said about racism and sexism. We need to address racism and sexism, no matter who's perpetrating these things. And rape is the same way. Rape is rape.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what gender they are. And when you eliminate the gender from it, you can actually look more clearly at what the real problems are.
That's
and
right.
I mean, just even to the basics of sexuality. Like, I actually toyed with the idea of being a sex therapist at one point, and some people, the people always assume it's because you're perverted or something. But for me, it was that my mother gave me a very healthy ideas about sex, and I would talk to other people, and they'd tell me these horror stories about how that would happen. And the reason that's relevant to what we're talking about is that men are kind of raised to become, in many cases in culture, they're almost kind of encouraged to be the player types in some societies, where they have all these girls, but a girl's not allowed to enjoy, sex. She's not allowed, she gets demonized for that. I mean, that was, is that, well, if she has multiple partners, she's a slut. If he has multiple partners, he's a stud. And there are reverses of that, just like you're pointing out. Boys are now, like the backlash of that is now boys are being treated like them even having a sex drive makes them evil. And actually that was another thing that plays into is that romance, in the classic sense seems to have vanished because every guy who might ask a girl out more than once is a stalker. Every guy who sends you flowers who maybe hasn't spoken to you yet, they're going to try to take you somewhere and cut up your body. It couldn't mean that they might just like you and might actually want to approach you. It actually creates a situation in relationships where men don't really know how to proceed. They're so terrified that they're going to get sexual harassment accusations or whatever. It's
absolutely terrifying. It's we're destroying just normal, natural human sexuality with all of these ridiculous rules and fears that we have. It's the shame that's being put on. It's outrageous. Humans have a right to enjoy their bodies. I mean, it all started back, in the Dark Ages, where sex was just absolutely vilified, and they needed to control the population. And that's where circumcision came in, to reduce sex drive and to reduce sensitivity. And that's practiced, has been practiced around the world towards both females and males. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the male genital mutilation is not taken very seriously, even though female genital mutilation is, and that's another issue that needs to be addressed. But yes, I mean, I think men are afraid to know how to approach women because they don't want to be seen as sexually harassing them. Mm-hmm. Women who like men are not sure how to proceed because they don't know what the rules are. I think it's just really frightening. And evolutionarily, when you look at the human species, men have just sort of a natural instinct to want to pursue the woman, and the woman has a natural instinct to send signals when she would like him to do that. And so we're losing all of those beautiful natural dances of courtship because women and men can't kind of do what nature intended them to do.
And I'm actually even in personal experiences now because you don't want to offend anybody, and also the issue that women seem to be raised in such a way that people are scared to approach them because if you're a guy who happens to find a girl attractive and interesting but could just be friends with her if she's not interested in that way, you have to weigh whether or not it's worth the risk. It's like I have female friends who I might like to ask out, but I'm like, I don't know, because every time you ask a girl out who's not interested, they never want to talk to you again. It's like they get creeped out or whatever, like they're given some impression that means there's something wrong, or it's like, no, I mean it. It's totally okay for us to just be friends, and I mean, it's gotten to the point where I'm blunt about it. I'm polite about it, and I say, hey, I would totally just be your friend, just like we already are. But I was curious if you might be interested in seeing each other outside of friendship. They're usually kind of shocked, but it works.
Yeah.
But there's so many little things that we just don't communicate about. I got to say, over the course of this show, we've discussed a lot of things that could be shows unto themselves, and I hope that you'll be a guest on V Radio again at some point. And the listener actually that I told you about who recommended you to me was very happy when I posted on our Facebook the link to this show. So, and now I would like you to take a moment and give the website URLs of like where people can find your work.
Sure. It's LaurieACouture.com. That's Laurie, middle initial A, and last name is COUTURE.com, LaurieACouture.com. And I also have a YouTube channel, which is Laurie A. Couture, and that has 6 videos on how to unschool your child, as well as a bunch of silly comedy videos my son and I do making fun of the hypocrisy of public school and how, children are diagnosed and drugged for normal childhood behavior. There are multiple places. My blog is also on LaurieACouture.com, and you can find me on Facebook and Twitter. I have a page called Laurie A. Couture, author of Instead of Medicating and Punishing, that people can like on Facebook.
That's excellent. And I'd actually like to talk to you briefly off the air after the broadcast, so stay connected. And
sure.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today. If this is your first time listening to V Radio, please check out my website, v-radio.org, or v-radio.org, v-radio.org. There in the archive section, you can find more shows like this one with lots of different guests, documentary filmmakers, scientists, behavioral experts like Dr. Gabor Mate, activists, presidential candidates have all been on my show in the past. And if you like what you hear, please consider a donation, because this is a listener-supported effort, and I go out into the field to interview people for these purposes, and essentially to bring you guys the alternative media. If you want there to be alternative media and you're sick of watching the mainstream media, then you're going to have to be willing to contribute to the alternative media. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in, and I'll leave you with some words from Jacques Fresco and Roxanne Meadows.
This is Roxanne Meadows.
And this is Jacques Fresco.
And you're listening to V Radio.